Today we'll be looking at John's use of these contrasting themes of light and darkness, love and hate. And he does this to show the contrast between the actions of the false teachers, those who have left the church, with the actions of a true Christian. We're called to love one another. This is Jesus' command. Our love for God is reflected in our love for one another. But what does that really look like in everyday life? And is our love for one another within the community of faith, is that really different from the love we see within the world? And if so, how? Well, we're going to be looking at these themes and some other themes as well as we seek to read faithfully our passage for today, 1 John chapter 2, verses 7 through 11. Let's get started. Picking up with verse 7, we see John refer to this group of believers as beloved. Now, in today's world, the term beloved has more of a romantic sense to it, and so some English versions will render the vocative here as dear friends. And that's to avoid that romantic sense, which John obviously didn't intend. But it's helpful to see the Greek word here is agapetoi, which is associated with the noun agape. It's a Greek word for love, or the verb agapao, to love. So beloved, in the intended sense of a pastor's love for his flock, it reflects his care and concern for this group of believers. And you also see that emphasis on this continuing theme of Jesus' command to love one another. Well, John continues here, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. So this phrase, from the beginning here, it refers to the beginning of the founding of the community of faith. From this local church, right? The moment when they first heard and believed. And he notes this commandment that he's telling them to love one another. It's not a new command. It's old in the sense that it goes back to the ministry of Jesus. In John 13, 34 and 35, Jesus says he's in the upper room talking to the disciples just before he goes to the cross, right? And he says, a new command I give to you, that you love one another. Even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Think about when Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment. And he said, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, right? Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. But he goes on to say, and love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19, 18. So it's old in the sense that it goes back to before these believers, when they first believed. It goes back to the time of Jesus and his ministry. But even that, it goes back, even at that, it goes back beyond his ministry to the Old Testament, to the Old Covenant era. But then John picks up in verse 8. He says, at the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. So John says it is old, but hey, it's also a new command. And we hear the words of Jesus here, don't we? This echo where Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, a new command I give to you, that you love one another. And so this command is old, but it's now new because this old command is now part of a new era. And these believers are able to fulfill this love command because they are new creations within this new era, transferred from the realm of darkness, empowered by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. In this new era, we also view this command on the other side of the cross, don't we? Our perspective is on the other side of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So we see the significance of this command to love one another against the backdrop of the demonstration of God's great love shown to us in Jesus Christ. The old era is now passing away as the new era dawns. And the darkness is passing away in the sense that Jesus is coming, inaugurated a new age, and his light began to shine into the darkness. John writes this command is true in him and in you, meaning that it was evident or truly seen in Jesus and also in them. Their faith is bearing fruit. You hear this encouragement from John. He says it's reflected in their lives as they live out their faith in the midst of this dark, broken world. The believers continue to reflect that light of Christ. The light of the dawn is chasing away the darkness of the long night of this present evil age, and will one day fully be present when there's a new heaven and a new earth, when Christ returns and all things are made new. And then we pick up at verse 9. John says, whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. So likely John is drawing on the words of those who have left the church, those who have pulled away and are pushing a false teaching about Christ and his atonement. And they're claiming to walk in the light, and yet they're not acting in love. And John uses the word hate here to draw a stark contrast between love and hate. There's no middle ground for John, and he wants that to be clear. And these words raise the question, so what does it mean to be in the light and to be in the darkness? So let's think about that just for a minute. To be in the light, what do you think that means? I'll give you a second to think about it. Maybe I'm talking too fast here. What does it mean to be in the light? Anything come to mind? Well, it means to be in the realm of God's light. This is a realm, living in the light of this new era that is breaking in, reflecting the light of God himself. You think about Colossians 1:13, it speaks of being delivered from the realm of darkness. Paul writes, he has delivered us from he's talking about God, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. And what about the realm of darkness? Again, it's a realm. It's the realm of sin, of worldly desires. It's a place devoid of a relationship with God. It's a realm that's hostile to God. So to be in darkness is to be in a realm absent of God's purifying and his guiding light. And so one stumbles through a broken world, and they have no light. They're without the guidance of the truth of Christ. And we move on to verse 10, and John says, whoever loves his brother, again we see that Greek word, it's the verb here, agapao. It's a participle for those of you who have a bit of Greek under your belt, or a lot of Greek. So we see the participle here, whoever loves his brother remains or abides in the light, and in him there's no cause for stumbling. So John now offers this contrasting example of those who love their brother. They walk in the light, they live consistently in the light, and they have no cause of stumbling. And so we talked about what it means to walk in the light. So let's look at the second description here of someone who loves his brother. In him or her, there's no cause of stumbling, John says. There is no scandalon, is the Greek word, in him. Now this could convey the idea that there's nothing in the life of the believer that would cause him or her to stumble in sin. But could also mean that one who loves his brother doesn't cause another brother or sister to stumble. They're not going to be a stumbling block. I think in the context here, John seems to emphasize the idea of loving one's brother and sister, which would include not being a stumbling block for other believers. So let us love one another, not only by serving actively, but also avoiding being a stumbling block to one another. We care for one another by being sensitive to the spiritual growth of each other. Let me point out a few things before we tackle the last verse here. Think about the radical nature of Christian love within the community of faith. What does that look like in a practical sense? Well, we could say caring for the needs of others in a self-sacrificing way, reflecting that self-sacrificial heart of Christ. It could include encouraging one another, listening, rebuking, serving, right? And even specifically being careful not to be a stumbling block to a fellow believer. But we won't do this perfectly, will we? So what do we do when there's division? What do we do when there's actions or words that words that cause hurt feelings. In the family of God, we need to be gracious. We need to be quick to forgive and quick to seek the forgiveness of those we may have hurt. And I recognize, even saying these words, that there's a complexity here, right? Because we're talking about human relationships. But we're talking about redeemed humans. We are different from the world. The bond we share is like nothing in the world. Our union is based on our union with Christ and the great unspeakable gift of forgiveness that we share. And as I was putting this lesson together, I thought about how sometimes reflecting the love of Christ, it's not only about how we care for one another, typically how we think about that, but it's also about how we respond when we hurt another Christian or when we've been hurt by another Christian. And I think that's part of it. When we look to the cross, we see we were forgiven at such great cost. We see an unspeakable love, and this should drive us to love one another. And so keep in mind, John is focusing on the community of faith here, loving one another in the church. And some reading this might say, well, what about loving everybody else? What about loving folks who are outside the church, who are unsaved? Doesn't the Bible talk about that? But note that John's not contradicting Jesus' teaching to love our enemies or love our neighbors as ourselves. We know John would absolutely agree with Jesus' words. So why focus on the community of faith here? Well, think about the context. That's always important. In this letter, the focus for John is to address the division in the church, this schism between believers and those who profess to be believers who've left the church. And so in light of how the false teachers are acting, John wants to highlight what true church love should look like. And finally, verse 11, John writes, "But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness." And this idea of walking is just affirming this idea of a pattern of life, consistent. They walk in darkness and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. The image here is of someone who does not have the guiding light of Christ, who in fact may think of themselves as someone who has it all figured out. Maybe you've come across someone like this. They see themselves as enlightened, educated, progressive, and yet sadly they just stumble in darkness. They don't have a saving knowledge of the gospel. They don't have a Christian worldview that would help them make sense of this world in which they live. They don't have the truth of Christ to guide them. And so in this passage, John says, the people who've left the church and are pushing this false teaching about Christ or acting unlovingly, they're walking in darkness, John says. And he talks about what true Christian love looks like. And he lets the believers know that they are fulfilling that command, that he sees that they are walking in the light and loving one another. And in his encouragement, notice he's encouraging them, you're doing this, but it's also an exhortation to them. Continue to strive to fulfill this command of Jesus, to love one another. And so we end with John's call to us today, as God's children, as those who walk in the light, to love one another. And Jesus' light is even now shining in the darkness, and we, as his followers, continue to reflect that light in our loving, gracious actions towards one another. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for watching till the end. I really appreciate your heart, your desire to grow and grow more deeply in your knowledge of the Bible and your knowledge of God. And I hope you find these videos helpful in that way. That's certainly my desire. So I look forward to being with you in the next video.